businesses living up to ESG, environmental, social, and governance requirements? I'm joined by two experts from the law firm of Crowell and Mooring. John Brew is an international trade and product risk management lawyer. Hello, John.
About
And Thomas Lorenzen specializes in environment, natural resources, and government affairs. Hello, Tom.
Hello.
And thank you both for being with me today. I want to talk about this new report from Crowell and Mooring, ESG survey, environmental performance and the stakes for your business. Tom, what are the highlights of that study? First of all, who did you survey and what are the big takeaways that came out of it?
Well, we surveyed well over 200 individuals involved in ESG. These are in-house counsel. They are ESG professionals and other leaders of corporations around the globe. What we found is that most organizations, a majority of organizations, have set environmental goals for themselves, but many are not actually measuring their progress towards those. There's a real lag between goal setting, measurement, and implementation.
Mm-hmm. Goal setting 60% and implementation or measuring 30%, right? Something like that?
30%.
That's a big gap.
Right about that.
Can you explain that gap? I'm just curious as to where that comes from. Is it just a lot of companies like to talk about ESG without doing anything about it, or what?
Well, I think part of it is that ESG is still developing, and understanding how to measure and how to implement are still things that people are thinking about. You know, what we see right now is a multiplication of the number of ESG criteria and benchmarking systems out there, and people are still trying to settle on those that suit their businesses best.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a one-size-fits-all scenario for everybody.
Yeah.
So there is process in that. I think people are also a little bit wary of what measuring may show them in terms of whether they are measuring up with their goals, and they're concerned about the risks that may create.
Mm-hmm. The disclosure aspects of it. John, what's your feeling about that, those particular results, especially as they relate to supply chain sustainability?
Yeah, in terms of supply chain, I really divided it into two categories. The first is going green, your carbon footprint, and more aspirational goals. We want to have a cleaner environment, and our customers, consumers want to have us operate a more clean business. The second is legal requirements, where like the Legacy Act and CITES, how you harvest, how you mine, forced labor. Again, ESG is a broad term. Forced labor comes under that. How do you comply with these legal obligations? And so to the extent that you're looking at aspirational goals, those are probably harder to implement and track, and companies are less interested in implementing and tracking those because you're not required to. Whereas a smaller universe of businesses who responded to this survey have actual legal requirements in their industry related to harvesting and foresting, Legacy Act, CITES, forced labor, things like that they have to comply with. Those companies are more focused on implementation of policies and procedures related to those ESG requirements.
Yeah, especially with regard to the increasing number of regulations around the world that cover all aspects of ESG. John, let me ask you also what you're hearing these days from in-house counsel, from sustainability professionals, from compliance professionals. I think you just sort of alluded to what they're telling you. Could you expand on that a little bit?
I think a couple things that came out of the survey and that I've seen is that to a large degree, in-house counsel doesn't have a lot of profile or visibility into ESG programs that the company's already running. So the company might have a forced labor or environmental programs that in which they've implemented to ensure compliance with regulations and that relate to ESG. But the lawyers aren't always directly involved initially or even later, and they come into play only when there are issues or problems with investigations or audits of issues related to ESG.
But this requires, at least from the sustainability aspect, it requires visibility of one's supply chain all the way back to the very beginning, to the farm, to the mine, to wherever the raw materials come from. I think would imagine a lot of companies just can't do that yet. Is that really a problem?
That's exactly right, and that's really the biggest problems for U.S. purchasers, for example, in trying to trace back their entire supply chain. Some industries are better than others. The fishing industry, for example, they've had more experience of that because of longstanding regulations.
Mhm.
And textile and apparel have done a better job of that because of worker issues. But for most industries, it's very difficult to get suppliers to provide that information. So it's important that you have contracts and agreements with your suppliers that allow you visibility into the supply chain back to the ground or the farm or the ocean.
Yeah. Tom, let me ask you is what you see the impact of recent actions by the Biden administration with relating to ESG issues.
Well, there are a few. First of all, we are hearing that the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to be issuing some sort of regulations regarding climate-related financial risk disclosures in the coming year. And that is already affecting the way companies are thinking about monitoring, keeping records of, and reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if you look at our report, our survey results, you'll see that most people are tracking their direct emissions, their scope 1 emissions.
Right.
A slightly smaller percentage of them are tracking their scope 2 emissions, which is their energy supply. But very few are looking at those scope 3 emissions, the supply chain issues that John was just talking about. I expect to see people ramping those monitoring efforts up as these disclosure requirements come into play. There is also this focus on environmental justice, which is a big ESG issue. How are your operations affecting disadvantaged communities, the communities where your industrial facilities, your transportation hubs are sited? And I expect we are going to see companies increase the number of audits they conduct about how their facilities are affecting those local communities and what steps they can take to improve the conditions there.
But it's not exactly new. I mean, the SEC up to this point has required disclosure on conflict minerals from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I don't know, to some extent that might have been weakened to the point where it became almost useless. I don't know how you're feeling about that is, Tom, but is that sort of along the same lines? This is just an amplification of SEC actions that have already been taken based on previous laws that were passed?
It is certainly an amplification of that, but I think we're seeing the SEC expanding into new areas. The idea that, as John said, you need to be tracking, for instance, the emissions of your suppliers in calculating your climate-related risk disclosure obligations is something that is new. Companies aren't adept at doing that. They need transparency into their suppliers. This is a critical issue, as John said, in contract negotiations. So we're seeing something new here.
But John, global supply chains are by definition so often multi-tier. Suppliers tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and getting visibility as you go further up those tiers becomes very difficult, if not impossible. So what do you see? Do you think that the political actions of the Biden administration or regulations now are going to force companies to achieve that visibility? I mean, how do they even tackle the issue?
Yeah, I think companies, industries, industry by industry and sector by sector will be forced to dive deeper back into their supply chain, depending on the laws and regulations. And it's going to take some time. Like I mentioned before, there are certain industries that are more advanced and able to trace their supply chain back. Other industries are going to follow suit, but it's going to take time and it's going to put pressure on suppliers to provide that information. And one of the interesting responses in our survey was that 30% of respondents have fired suppliers because they didn't meet their environmental standards. That number could be going up. And so the pressure on suppliers is going to be, if you don't get the information, we're going to go to somebody else who can. And so I think that gradually will ramp up and you'll see a movement towards that. The problem is with all the other problems in the supply chain, COVID, employment, port congestion, things like that, the ESG elements can get lost in the shuffle and other problems can overtake it. So it's not going to be easy for anybody.
Not just in terms of prioritizing what companies need to survive today, but in terms of not being able to go personally to visit suppliers overseas and check out to see whether they're really conforming to their supplier code of conduct, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately will be a risk assessment. right? Each company in each industry will have to do a risk assessment, and we'll prioritize.
Yeah. I want to ask each of you, let me start with Tom. Give us a takeaway based on your findings of the study and based on your own practice and your own expertise in this area. Give us some advice on how companies can navigate these ESG issues going forward, how they can up their game in ESG performance.
Well, one, I think that one of the most critical things is that companies want to be able to tout their environmental, their ESG bona fides. And that depends on the company having really a single ESG clearinghouse. The right hand needs always to know what the left hand is doing, and there needs to be an individual or a unit within a company that is collecting and coordinating that ESG information so that you are not saying inconsistent things about your performance. One of the biggest threats to companies right now is not regulation and the risks of not complying with regulations, but claims of greenwashing, saying that you are greener than you actually are, and thus subjecting yourself to potential litigation under the Federal Trade Commission's green guides or from private consumer groups that may think that you are overstating what you're accomplishing. So you need to involve your legal department in assessing how you're doing and what you're saying. And you need to make sure that everything that you are saying can be backed up by data.
Yeah.
Golds are more easily defended than claims of actual performance.
John, what's your advice on the supply chain side?
I guess I'd give 3 pieces of advice. The first is a risk assessment, conducting a risk assessment of ESG and your policies and practice and suppliers, and determining where your higher risk are. That's how you prioritize. The second is communication, contracting, and dealing with your suppliers and opening those lines of communications and making sure you can get the information you need to trace back. And then third is what Tom alluded to, is in-house counsel participation and developing a clear ownership within your company and structure and policies within your company of the actions that you will implement and how you will handle ESG issues.
John Brew, Thomas Lorenzen with Crowell and Mooring. I want to thank you both for spending the time with me to share your expertise on what companies should be doing right now in order to shore up their ESG performance going forward. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.